Time describes the joy of tax as a frontal assault on this orthodoxy and the dangerous policies it legitimises. Now please give a warm welcome to our guest speaker tonight, Richard Murphy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to come along. It does feel very headmasterly up here. If you're used to a modern lecture theatre, you'll know that actually the lecturer is at the bottom and the people you're talking to are above you, so this feels all the wrong way round. It's been an interesting summer. Can I make it clear, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I am unambiguously of the left, and I don't pretend otherwise, and make no apology for it. But my work has been funded by largely Quaker charities for a number of years. And as a result, in theory, any party that comes and asks me, I will help. Over the summer, I was in fact challenged by right-wingers on my blog. Some of you will be aware that I do blog quite a lot. Only 4 today. But I was challenged about whether I was doing party political work with charitable money. And a solicitor asked me the question, is that true? And I said, I don't think so. And he said, what's the evidence? I said, well, admit that in May I did write about 60% of the Labour Party's tax manifesto for Ed Miliband. Okay, that doesn't sound good, he said. Did write 80% of the Greens as well. Oh, did you? Yep. 100% of the NHA parties. In 2010, Vince Cable borrowed ideas from me, which were legislated in 2012, when George Osborne had to appoint me to a committee. And he said, I think we're getting the impression that you haven't got much risk here. I am a creator of ideas. That is what I do. That's my job. It is when I decided to go out and become a freelance writer, thinker, with the backing of my wife, who decided that this was something we should do when we had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, the obvious time to take the risk and give up your secure income, that we should do this, and I was going to go out, and I told her, it's okay, I'm going to write things and I'm going to try and change the world. I had no lack of ambition, and that's what I've tried to do ever since. That was at the time we created the Tax Justice Network. When we created the Tax Justice Network, John Christensen and I, my main co-partner in crime on that particular exercise, I call it crime, I think we've been trying to fight crime in truth, we started the first ever campaigning organisation on tax, because we both had an enthusiasm for the subject, although John denies he's as keen as me. In fact, I should tell you that my wife is a medic, and she thinks that I suffer from a condition which she has never seen before, and which I will die with but not of, which is excitement by taxation. Because she certainly had to put up with it. She reckons our Cocker Spaniel knows more about tax, except he can't talk about it. But we set out to create an organisation to talk about tax. And most people thought that was an extremely bizarre thing to do. And The Joy of Tax is a title that has actually been floating, waiting for a book to go with it for about 9 years. It was thought up one night with the aid of a little whiskey, if I'm completely honest. And there it was. Other books came and went, and I couldn't think what book went with the idea, The Joy of Tax. And eventually it occurred to me, last year, but the book was actually written between May and August this year in something of a rush. Most of my books are written in something of a rush. That tax is the thing that has the greatest potential. That is what the joy of tax is. Its power to literally change society. And that is what drove John and myself when we started the Tax Justice Network. If you look back, in 2002, you would have found almost nothing in the press on tax at all. Large companies could do what they liked and nobody paid any attention. Tax havens existed without almost any notice. Only one NGO had ever published a report on tax havens, which was Oxfam in 2000, and their trustees got so frightened of it when they published it that they said, we're never going to go there again. They've changed their mind since, but it took them some time to get the courage to go back. And we decided we were going to put tax on the agenda because of this shared belief that tax could shape society. And we did it quite simply by deciding that we would put large companies on the front pages of newspapers by talking about their activities in tax havens that cost developing countries a great deal of money, we believed. It was a very simple strategy. It took a while. We didn't make any major breakthroughs in the first 3 years. Campaigning does require a little persistence. In 2005, for the first time, we estimated how much money we thought was offshore in the world. At that stage, I did the first ever estimate of the amount of money offshore in the world. I thought it was $11.5 trillion. A trillion's got 12 noughts on the end of it, by the way, for those who are not familiar in counting in trillions. Why not? But that's the amount of money we thought was offshore. We have since discovered that we got that number hopelessly wrong. We were, of course, massively criticised at the time for ghastly overestimation and misstating the truth and lying and everything under the sun, which has been the standard first attempt of the right wing to dismiss everything we've ever said, and for tax havens to dismiss everything we've ever said. It now transpires the real number is somewhere between 21 and 32 trillion. So we were out by a massive factor in the underestimation rather than the overestimation. And the figure which we came up with for the loss of money as a result to developing countries was at that stage 255 billion a year, and actually the latest OECD estimate is 240 billion a year, and they always do underestimate. They are very conservative. That's the money lost to the world because of the one issue we chose to focus on to get this issue onto international agendas. I can't say the rest is history once we started going and once we published that number. But in 2005, we picked on a large company. We called it Microsoft because it was, except it wasn't. It was called Round Island 1 Limited. That's the company in Ireland that sold all Microsoft's products around the world in 2005. And I came up with a simple number, which was at that point, Bill Gates had made more money by having his company located in Ireland than he'd given away to tax havens. He'd given away to charity. And that started a long history of us putting companies on the front pages of newspapers. In 2008, our campaign got a bit of a boost. The world's banks fell over. Where did they fall over? In part, they fell over in tax havens. The one that we drew most attention to was, of course, Northern Rock. And it started a little rivalry between Robert Peston and myself. Robert got the story about Northern Rock falling over because he was very well connected with Number 10. His father is, after all, a Labour peer, Lord Peston. But I got the story that, in fact, 40% of Northern Rock was technically owned by a trust that was run from Guernsey, set up for the benefit of the Down Syndrome Association of the North East of England. I thought I'd phone up the Down Syndrome Association for the North East of England and ask them if they knew that there were nearly £40 billion of assets in a trust being run for their benefit. The Observer got some interest when they said, "We don't know about that." They didn't know anything about it at all. They were being used. And what we began to develop and show and get in the press time and again was that all over the world, banks and large companies were using the finance system to hide their assets from view in offshore companies, in trusts, and other arrangements run by high street UK banks and well-known firms of accountants, including the one that trained me, who were, between them, using tax havens to launch a full frontal assault on a democracy. Because I don't think it's anything less than that. I was recently asked on the BBC if I would like to name the 4 biggest threats to democracy, and I said, oh, that's easy, that's PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, Ernst & Young and KPMG. They thought I was going to say Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and I don't know who else. But no, I decided it was them because there is a concerted attack upon the ability of democratically elected governments to collect the tax owing to them by companies that are located in their country because of the existence of tax havens. And it was the way we could demonstrate this. And along came other stories following that, because Once 2008 happened, the world's politicians were looking for someone to blame. And I have to say, Gordon Brown picked up on tax havens, picked up on the work that we'd done, quite blatantly. I mean, I spent time in number 10 Downing Street at that point in time, and advised them on tax havens and what we thought they were doing. And it became the focus of the April 2009 London G8 summit, which was a quite extraordinary event. Extraordinary for me because I was the first ever blogger in the world to ask a question at a G8 summit. And I also was there all day seeing the events that went on. But it was a tipping point. Suddenly the world knew that the tax systems were rigged against the interests of ordinary people in favour of banks and large companies, and that there were in the world a group of people, bankers, lawyers and accountants, who were setting themselves up in business to exploit this. A friend of mine, Prem Sikka, professor of accounting at Essex University, calls them the pinstripe mafia, and I think he does so with some good reason, because they are there fighting a war which at that stage was still very much about hiding what was going on in these places from view. And John and I and others, because by then we'd recruited Christian Aid and Action Aid and Oxfam and Europe and many other NGOs, we persuaded them that there really was this enormous cost to developing countries. So this became a development issue. And I also persuaded the campaigns for the extractive industries, the companies who take oil, gas, timber and other supplies out of developing countries in particular, that transparency with regard to tax would let us make sure that tax was paid in the right place at the right time. So we took that campaign and we began to expand our reach. And so we looked at companies called Google and Amazon and Starbucks, for example. You will actually find my name in all those stories in the original versions. The Google story, in fact, took 3 years to get off. We wrote it in 2008, nobody was interested. We wrote it in 2009, nobody was interested. And in 2010, it went around the world, closely followed by all the others. It was odd how it took time to get going. But once we got going, boy, did we get going. In 2000, to give you an example, in 2009, I sat in the UK Treasury. Remember, it was a Labour Treasury in those days. And we were talking about how we could get information out of tax havens to the UK so we could tax people in this country on the wealth that they had hidden in places like Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, all branch offices of the City of London, by the way, because that's what they are. They aren't fully independent places. They're British overseas territories and crown dependencies. They're about as independent as Kent County Council is from Westminster. And we were trying to get information from them. And they told me, you will not in your lifetime succeed in getting information from those places, Richard. So John and I were at a meeting. We looked at each other. I went home and wrote a paper because that's my reaction to everything I do. I just go home and write another paper because I do have a habit of writing a lot of words. Wrote down how we thought we could do it. And we set out to get it. The information starts flowing next year. In 2003, as a result of the first ever conversation that John and I had, I celebrated my youngest son sleeping through the night by writing something called country-by-country reporting. I do think I'm the only person on earth who's ever celebrated their son sleeping through the night by writing a draft international accounting standard. So I had so much energy when he slept that I decided to celebrate. It was called country-by-country reporting. Next year, the world's multinational companies are going to have to report on that basis to tax authorities to prove whether they're paying their tax in the right place at the right time. The tax justice campaign has come an awful long way. More in some ways than we could ever have expected. And yet we're not there. We're not there in all sorts of ways. One way we're not there is that we've made progress in getting these things onto statute books, internationally, in the UK, in tax havens and so on. But we don't know that they're going to be enforced yet. And we haven't changed the political environment around tax. In particular, we still have George Osborne to deal with, if I'm honest. He is called a substantial obstacle to progress. That's a technical phrase. So whilst we have all the right pieces in paper in place now, next year we will have multinational companies reporting to HM Revenue and Customs a lot more information about where they make their money. The big question is, will all the people who could use that information have been sacked by George Osborne before they even get to actually use the data? Because the revenue is having its budget cut by 18% over the next few years. Near enough, 1 in 5 people who work for the revenue will lose their job over the next 5 years. In 2005, there were 91,000 people working for the revenue. They're down to around 60,000 now. We're going to be heading well short of 50,000 in the next few years. Is that deliberate? Oh, yes, it is. You cannot collect tax without people, and George is doing that. We're going to get all this information from 90 other countries around the world, including the major tax havens, about which people from this country have got accounts abroad and which should therefore be taxed here. But just at the moment we're going to get that data, we're going to be sacking loads of people who might be able to use it to collect the money owing. Could that be deliberate? I think there's a risk. We have a government who is not committed to collecting tax. I will lay the allegation out very clearly. The last one wasn't. The Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives seemed to be quite happy to join together in a coalition that was dedicated to cutting the size of our tax authority. At the very time when they said the scarcest commodity in the world was tax revenue, which was why we must have austerity, they decided to cut our tax collection ability. It is a complete, well, you could call it a paradox, except the fact it's obviously not a paradox because it's so deliberately planned that this outcome was what they wanted, that we did not collect money. And so if you look at what happened in 2008, if you look at the graphs, and I published a paper on this, an academic paper on this last week, until 2008, every year, Labour collected in tax the amount of money they'd spent the year before. There wasn't really a significant deficit. It's just that the tax revenues came in a year later than the spend. So we did borrow money, but only because the money was coming in a bit slower, a bit later than the spending commitments took place. But we borrowed less than 3% of our total national income a year, which in any risk assessment that has ever been done by any macroeconomist anywhere in the world is considered to be about as safe a way to run an economy as you can do it. That's how cautious Gordon Brown was. He didn't drop, some of you will remember Gordon Brown's notoriously dull budget speeches, which were always littered with the word prudence.
Whether I was doing party political work.
And they were. What happened in 2008 was that the private banks failed. And something quite staggering became clear to us, which had not been clear because we'd had an economy which had not faced a crisis like that since the Second World War. What we realised was that since Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, the entire money production system and banking system and the control of the banking system have passed completely out of the hands of the Treasury and entirely into the hands of the private sector or the Bank of England, which has to be independent, it is said, of government, so it is beyond democratic control. I'm afraid to say that was Ed Ball's biggest mistake. I have a history of disagreeing with Ed, and it seemed over the summer that Yvette Cooper wasn't too keen on me either because she thought I was challenging the independence of the Bank of England. Like heck I was. Yeah. Why should we have a Bank of England that is not under the control of democratically elected politicians? Actually, in the case of the City of London, this goes back a long way. I would remind you that in 1066, there's this chap who arrived on the coast near here, a bit south, and he conquered England. But he made peace with the City of London. And that's because, just like every king of the era, he didn't raise tax, get a nice piggy bank full of money, and then decide who shall I go to war with. Just like David Cameron today, he decides, I found someone to go to war with and I'm so excited I'll do it and I'll borrow the money and I'll pay it back later. Has he asked questions about how he's going to pay for every one of those missiles he's going to drop in Syria? I haven't heard that debated. No. I'm afraid leaders have this habit of going to war. History does seem to show this, and I'm sure that Syria will. You can sort of guess where I am on this one, can't you? I am a Quaker, by the way. It's not surprising if I'm anti-war. They have to borrow money, and that's what they've always done. So William the Conqueror went to the City of London and said, "Can I have a loan, please, to pay my troops who've just beaten England and made me king?" And they said, "No problem, you can have it." So he wrote Doomsday Book. What was Doomsday Book? It's the register, it's the tax base, it's how he's going to collect the money to pay back the City of London. And when we come to Magna Carta, which is supposedly our first statement of rights, all of you know the clauses of Magna Carta, of course, inside out, don't you? I know 3, if I'm honest, 3. Number 12 says, "The king may tax if he consults." Seems reasonable. Number 13 says, "The rights of the City of London shall not be prejudiced." Number 14 suggests who he should consult with, which included people like probably the abbot in Faversham, the bishop at Canterbury, and a few others. That's the sort of people he had to talk to. But there in the middle was the City of London, and there it still is. And we have now, literally in this country, that same crisis. We have an entire economic system dominated by the interests of banking and commerce and a captured economics profession. I have to say that I think a great many of my academic colleagues as economists, I'm a political economist, by the way, I'm not an economist. There is a difference. I don't spend my entire life doing maths for no purpose. I actually think as well. That's a little underhand, but probably true about the average economist. They all are combined to say, in combination, that wealth is created by the private sector and the state may live, if it has to, on whatever the private sector can afford to spare for it. And taxation must be raised to pay for every single element of spending that occurs, when none of that is true. William the Conqueror borrowed the money to pay to conquer England. The Bank of England, well, it wasn't the Bank of England, but the banks at the time lent him the money. Simply trust. And these days, every single penny of it is printed. I can show you that. Because somewhere or other on the way down here, oh, there you are. It's printed. And it says on it, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand." So what is that? You think that's money, don't you? That's the national debt. That's what the UK national debt looks like. If, by the way, of course, you go in and say, "Please pay me back my money, I'd like my £20 that you just promised to pay me," they'll say, "Yeah, sure, have that one in exchange." What's the difference? There is no difference. It's all made up money. And what we discovered in 2008 was it's that promise on these that matters. The government gives the promise to pay, but the private sector takes the profit from making the money. 97% of all the money in this country is created by private banks. It doesn't look like that. It's an entry in a bank account. And all entries in bank accounts are fictional. You might not like to know that, especially those of you who think you've got money in your bank accounts. They don't exist. There's no money there. None at all. It's just made up. How do you make up money? I will tell you. If I go into a bank now, let's assume it's a bank that I haven't got an account at. Let's call it Barclays, because I've never had an account at Barclays. I'm of the age where some of you might remember why you didn't have an account at Barclays. I spent a lot of time outside Barclays, but not in it, in the 1970s. Let's assume I go in and ask. It was apartheid for those who are too young to remember. There might be a few, but that's what it was all about. You go in and say, "I'd like to borrow £10,000 to buy a car." They say that's fine, Mr. Murphy. They do not go in and check in the vault whether they've got 10,000 quid in these. Largely because I don't want 10,000 quid in these. It's kind of inconvenient to carry that much around. I want an entry in my bank account. So they open me a current account and they put 10,000 in it. And they open a loan account and they put 10,000 in it. I'm an accountant. I'll tell you, one of those is a debit and one is a credit. It doesn't matter. As far as you're concerned, one is a positive and one's a negative. And you know what? They add up to nothing. There was no money before I went in, and they just opened 2 accounts, and they put 10,000 positive in one and 10,000 negative in the other, and I thought I could spend the money. And I can. I can go and buy a car with it now. And you know what? Somebody will accept it as money. It's amazing. Because we believe it's money. That's how all money's made. Every single element. Even this stuff. After all, it isn't worth 20 quid, and it doesn't cost 20 quid to make that. Not at all. It's just made up. It's a confidence trick. But you believe it. And the reason you believe it is that the government says it will pay. And in 2008, we discovered it would pay. It did pay. It paid out for Northern Rock. Lots of people kept their money in bank accounts because the government guaranteed, I think it was 80,000 quid in 2008, if you had money in a bank account, they would pay out the first £80,000 in that bank. Therefore, it was the government's promise, not the banker's promise, that kept the system going. And yet, since then, they've said, you cannot use that power to create money for public good. You can only use it for private good. Now, that's what I challenged this summer. We were going to talk about QE tonight, because we're in the QE school. People's quantitative easing is not the same as the quantitative easing that Ed Balls came up with in 2009. That was created by a friend of mine, a chap called Richard Werner, who's a professor of economics at Southampton University, and a decidedly unusual thinker, a very clever thinker, and he came up with the idea that we could actually bail out banks by printing new money. In this country, we printed 375 billion of new money to bail out our banking system. That is 1/4 of our current national debt. How do we do it? The Bank of England simply formed a new subsidiary company. It's called Bank of England Asset Purchase Facility Limited, which isn't exactly rolling off your tongue, but don't worry about it. They created a subsidiary and they wrote 375 billion owed to the Bank of England, 375 billion pounds in its current account. That was how you create 375 billion of cash. You do it by just typing the numbers onto your keyboard and it's there. Because you're the Bank of England, people think you're good for 375 billion. A touch more than Barclays might think I'm worth, but that's what you can do if you're the Bank of England. And they went out and they bought the government's debt, gilts. So, as a result, the government, which owns the Bank of England, don't believe any of the rumours which go around which says the government does not own the Bank of England, it does own the Bank of England, ended up buying 375 billion of the government's own debt. It's like me going out and buying my wife's debt when we've only got a joint bank account. I end up, in that case, with a debt which my wife owes me when actually she could write me the cheque to pay it and it would all go to our same account so it doesn't count to anything. That's literally what happened. The government bought its own debt back. And yet we were told we had a debt crisis. We were in such a dire situation we were going to end up like Greece. We were going to end up being unable to afford these debts. We were going to leave them saddled upon the young forever. But we bought 1/4 of it all back by just making up some 375 billion. The national debt, you will be told at the moment, is 1,560 billion. What it is, it's less 375 billion, which the government owns. You can't owe yourself money. It's just not possible. That money's been cancelled. That national debt, that debt's gone. The government says that we're going to have all this interest to pay, well, except 1/4 of it is paid to the government. I have a fortune in income every year. I gave myself a salary of 100,000. I paid it from my right pocket to my left pocket. That's literally what the government now does with interest on 1/4 of the national debt. It pays it from its right pocket to its left pocket. It's meaningless. The banking system says, but you can't do the same again for the benefit of ordinary people. Oh no, you can't do that. That would rock the system. I was staggered this summer when Yvette Cooper went around saying, if we do people's quantitative easing, the world will basically collapse. People's quantitative easing is a variation on that idea of printing money. It is printing money. But instead of giving it to the banking system to keep it solvent, it's simply about using the money that is printed by the Bank of England to build houses and schools and transport systems and everything else that we need as a society. Out of money we can make up out of thin air. And we can do that when we have unemployment, and when we're not running an economy at full-blown strength, and we definitely aren't running an economy at full-blown strength right now. So we have spare capacity without any risk of inflation at all, because you might have noticed there are a lot of people in this country who do not have enough money to live on and need a real pay rise. The whole aim of quantitative easing is to increase people's wages to the point where we have a risk of inflation when you stop doing people's quantitative easing and you then row back a bit. That's why you couldn't use it to do something like HS2, because once you start HS2, you can't end it in a field north of Buckingham. It's kind of embarrassing to have a railway line stopping in the middle of nowhere. But you can build houses because you can get to the end of the street and say, okay, we'll wait for somebody else to do that another time. Now, People's QE was designed to do that. It was designed to create modest inflation, because one of the purposes of QE was to create inflation, 2%. There has been 7 trillion euros worth of total QE around the world at the moment between the US, UK, Europe, Japan and Sweden. And anybody know what the total UK inflation rate is at the moment? It's about minus 0.1. So despite that 375 billion we spent, we ended up with negative inflation rate. But according to Yvette Cooper, I was going to bring down the entire economy because I suggested we spent 50 billion on building housing. It's just not credible, possible, believable, real at all. It was a policy to get Britain back to work using our finance system. And it was done deliberately because we don't need to tax everything to pay in that situation. We can make money. And in fact, every single penny the government spends is created, printed in the first instance, and then claimed back by taxation. That is why, since 1694, when we started the national debt, it's always gone up, with very odd exceptions. Gordon Brown did manage to reduce it for 3 years. But that was an extraordinary event. Almost never happens. It goes up for 2 reasons. First of all, spending always precedes taxation. And secondly, if we didn't have any national debt, we wouldn't have any of that, because the national debt is money. That's exactly what it is. That is debt because it says, I promise to pay you. There's 62 billion of that. Of the 1.5 trillion, 62 billion is that. And if George Osborne had his way and started cancelling the national debt, do you know how much money we'd have left in the economy? None. Yeah. What he wants to do is this. He wants to tear money up. He wants to destroy it. Oh, that is, by the way, what you do when you cancel the national debt. You destroy money. It's all right, you can stick them back together with a bit of sellotape. They always accept them. I know. I've tried it before. I did that for a bunch of students in October. They gasped in horror that somebody could tear up a 20 quid note. I spent it later on. So, but that is literally what it means to repay debt. You're cancelling, destroying money, and yet we need money to keep the economy going. It is as balmy as that. Now, if all of government spending comes initially from printing money, why do we tax? We tax to stop inflation. We don't tax to raise money to pay for government services, because we don't need to. Because to pay for any amount of government services, we can print another of those. But if we print too many of them, it is absolutely right that we would end up with inflation. And we don't want to end up with too much inflation. So tax is the mechanism that we use to stop inflation, not the mechanism that we use to pay for government services. Once you understand that economic reality, and I assure you that is economic reality, which we've understood, some economists have understood for about 100 years, but it's taken a long time to persuade the Bank of England that's right. Do you know when the Bank of England admitted that this was true? April 2014. They finally admitted that this is how the banking system works. And they actually put out a bulletin in April 2014 saying, almost every economic textbook is wrong about money. What I've just told you is the right version. It took us a while to persuade them. But they now accept that, in fact, all government services are paid for by printing money. Tax reclaims that from the economy. But once you see tax as reclaiming money from the economy, which has been previously printed by the government, then tax becomes that mechanism for shaping society. Because it doesn't have to pay for the services anymore. Instead, it's about redistributing wealth. It's about repricing market failure. It's about making sure that people engage with government. Yes, I do believe there's a social contract between people and government, and that when people pay tax, there is an extraordinary body of evidence that says when people pay tax, they vote. It's income tax, by the way, only, because people don't see VAT, they don't see any other tax, they see income tax, which is why the whole policy of increasing personal allowances pursued by the last government and the Liberal Democrats in particular is so wrong, because when you take people out of paying tax, they literally don't count anymore. The only people who count to a government are the people who pay tax. They don't count anymore, and therefore they drop out of the policy agenda. So you end up with some hideous situations like we'll take away tax credits as well. So at that moment, tax becomes an instrument to change the way we want to look at society. And I believe that that's how we need to view tax. We need to understand money and tax as an integrated system, and then we reclaim it to achieve the society we want, which is precisely, of course, why those on the right wing want the Bank of England to be independent and under the control of bankers, and why they don't want economic policy to be based in the Treasury, and why they want this whole narrative that, oh, it's a household, we can't afford, we've got a maxed out credit card, which is one of the most stupid ideas of all. The maxed out credit card idea presumes that there's a limited number of these in the world. There aren't. I just destroyed one. So of course there aren't a fixed number of these in the world. We can have as many of these as we like, so long as we tax to stop the inflation. Enough tax to stop the inflation. But a growing economy with a growing number of people needs more money to go around. And the only way you can deliver more money to keep the economy going around is by running a deficit. Because that's the only way we can make enough government-backed money, and all money is ultimately government-backed. And yet, even now, we have the insult that this note is issued by the Bank of England, not by the government. Because right-wing economists say we can't trust the government with money. So the Bank of England, which is independent, must issue the money. We did once issue government-backed money. Only once have we issued government-backed money in this country. Does anybody know when it was? August 1914, in fact. 300 million of banknotes, and they were Treasury banknotes. They were not Bank of England banknotes. It's the only time the government's ever issued banknotes. And you know what? Nobody batted an eyelid. They used them as if they were the same as Bank of England banknotes. Nobody knew. Nobody cared. But they worked. So we don't have to have Bank of England banknotes. We can actually have a system which is under political control. If the left is going to actually reclaim the economy to achieve the goals it wants, it has to understand money, it has to understand tax, and it has to say we're going to use the power to print money and the power to tax for social gain to deliver the world that we want. That was what the fight was about in the Labour Party this summer when they went mad about people's QE. An idea that I created which Jeremy Corbyn borrowed. I didn't actually write Corbynomics, by the way. I didn't write it for Jeremy. Although I know him, I know John McDonnell and I've known both of them for 10 years. They borrowed it. I didn't actually know it was Corbynomics until 2 days before the policy was launched when they asked me to go along and speak at the launch event. And I said, why? They said, don't you know? I said, no. Oh, we'd better send you the economic policy. And I discovered that it actually said it was written by Richard Murphy. They borrowed it off my blog but hadn't told me at that point. And so by accident, I became the author of Corbynomics. I'm not complaining, not for a moment. I'm delighted they borrowed the ideas. But people's QE is a step in that direction. And the dividing line in the Labour Party then was Are we frightened of bankers, or are we going to bring the banks under control? If Labour, if any party in this country, is going to run this economy for the benefit of people, we have to put the banks under the control of our government. At the moment, Magna Carta still rules. Clause 13, the rights of the City of London will be respected, are still in operation 800 years later. We're still letting a state within a state run our banking system, run our democracy, because it controls the power to print money when that should belong to us for our benefit, not with the government subsidising the creation of money for the benefit of the banking system. And that was also why we have to take on the tax havens. I started with tax havens. The tax havens are simply another mechanism that the City of London uses to undermine our government. All of this is an integrated policy. All of it is an assault on our democracy. And we are at the point where, I'm afraid to say, this has become a fundamental fight. Late last week, there was an article in the Financial Times. I mentioned the idea of country-by-country reporting. It sounds like a simple idea. I'm going to finish with it, but don't explain it. Country-by-country reporting is simply asking the world's multinational companies to publish a report of every country in which they operate. Most of them don't say that. And how much they make there, and how much tax they pay there. We would then know which ones were shifting their profits into low tax havens, and not paying the right amount of tax here. It's very simple. It's very obvious. According to the Financial Times, it's going to be the biggest political fight in the remaining period of Obama's administration, because the US is now being expected to implement the standard, which I first wrote in 2003, which was adopted by the OECD in 2014, and which they're being asked to put into effect. And they see that demand for information to make sure that companies are taxed as a full frontal assault on American capitalism. I want to tell you something. It's not an assault on capitalism. Capitalism, and I believe very firmly in a mixed economy. I'm a chartered accountant. I have created companies, trade unions, and I have actually working for trade unions on policy. So I'm in an odd position. Capitalism works when there's perfect information, when people know what's going on, when money can be given to those best able to use it. The system that American capitalists are trying to defend is one where monopoly is created so people are exploited. That's what we're up against. Tax is at the forefront, accidentally in my case, but we're actually at the forefront of the fight between the rights of people to have the services that they need and the lives that they want to live. Or do we grant that power to the world's major corporations? It's got as blunt as that. It's going to be dirty, it's going to be fun, and I hope we win it. Thank you. Pay them more, well, they'll pay more tax, and if they pay more tax, we will actually raise more money than we spend on them. There is a thing called the multiplier. The government assumes at the moment, George Osborne assumes, it's the basis of his economic forecast, that for every £1 the government spends, only 60p goes into national income. 40p of every £1 the government spends, according to George Osborne, is wasted, gone, disappeared. That hotbed of international socialism, the International Monetary Fund, based in that well-known revolutionary location, Washington, D.C., thinks that the figure is well over £1 of worth is created for every £1 of government spending. And if it's spent on investment, then it's at least £1.70 of income is created for every £1 spent. There's a fundamental difference of view there. George Osborne simply thinks that government is bad. And he's gone into office to try to disable the whole process of government. That's why he wants to shrink government from 41% to 36%, and we'll have all the pain that goes with that. So we have to tell an alternative story, is that we can spend, we won't go bust, that I'm afraid this story that quantitative easing is bad for us is completely untrue, that it's actually created value. It could deliver us all the houses we want. We could have young people in homes, and we have to keep repeating that story. And I'm afraid to say that's what we have to do, time in, time out, and that's my strategy. So last Thursday I broadcast 3 times during the course, or Wednesday during the course of the spending review. I get on air, I write articles, but unfortunately the number of economists and commentators who are willing to believe this are relatively limited. And even The Guardian is now torn down the middle between those who are frightened of the bankers and those who will take the bankers on. And you can virtually divide the world like that. Are we going to live in a world which is run by, for the benefit of bankers, or are we going to live in a world which is run for the benefit of people? And we need more economists who are willing to stand up. But they do exist. Danny Blanchflower, a friend of mine who was on the Monetary Policy Committee, Joe Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, these are all people who are willing to help John McDonnell as well. These people will stand up and be counted and say, yeah, we do think a different world is possible. I did make a comment that actually I do think if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister, the banks would try it on. They would try and create a sterling crisis. They would threaten to pull out. And bluntly, my answer to that is, that's fine. You can go. And there's a good reason for that. That does not say Lloyds Bank on it, or HSBC. It would in Scotland, but by the way, Scottish banks have to have one of these for every Scottish £20 note they print. So they don't make their own money, by the way. People think Scottish notes are somehow printed by Scottish banks. Yeah, but there's actually one of these behind every one of them. They aren't allowed to print unless they've got currency from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England makes all the money. The banks don't actually make the money. The Bank of England can. If the Bank of England refused to cooperate, then I would suggest that the answer to Mark Carney would be what I said on Radio 4 one morning during August this year, which is he can then get on the next plane. Because this would be the point where the Treasury would have to actually say, we're in command here, we will issue our banknotes. We will simply meet the demand for money, however much it is. If there's a run on a bank, we'll print money. In theory, you can print money in any denomination you like. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman did actually come up with quite a neat way of repaying the US debt, by the way. He just suggested they minted a coin worth $1 trillion and then paid the debt off. And in theory, there is nothing to stop the Americans creating a $1 trillion coin and paying off their debt. We could create a trillion pound coin, in theory. So could the banks leave? Yes, they could try to. The big risk is, of course, that would leave us with some chaos temporarily. So we would have to nationalise the banks. One of the things that I have suggested is that actually we shouldn't let the banks own the infrastructure of banking. We should actually own the banking infrastructure, the clearance system, the bank account numbers, the sort codes and everything, just as we actually do own Network Rail, and we should let the banks operate on our banking system as franchisees. So we would separate the banking system from the banks, so that if they decided to play up or go bust, we would be able to immediately take over, just as when somebody failed on the East Coast route. I can't remember who the last person who went bust on the East Coast route was, before the government took over and made a lot of money out of it, but they couldn't. They went bust on a Friday, and on Saturday morning the trains ran. They were just under state control. That's what we need to do. Will they actually cost us money if they leave? No, they won't cost us money if they leave. We would have a problem of temporary disruption. And that would simply be overcome by nationalising the banks. How would the banks work? Very easily. If HSBC decide to go to Hong Kong tomorrow, do you know all their employees in Faversham are not moving to Hong Kong? They'll be in Faversham. Oh, sorry then. All right. I didn't know there wasn't a... I didn't have a chance to check every bank in the high street, sorry.
There is an HSBC closing.
Oh, right. It's going to Hong Kong. Yes, okay, shoot yourself in the foot. But whichever bank it is, the people will not be moving. They'll all be here, a tiny number of people. It's rather like Starbucks, by the way, when they said they were going to move their head office to the UK. Do you know how many people are coming to the UK to move their head office to the UK from the Netherlands? That's 8. That's what their head office employs. All the baristas were here anyway, and now they've just got a few head office staff. So if they leave, all the banks, all the infrastructure, all the organisation will be here. And even HSBC won't actually leave. I'll tell you why they won't leave. They make a lot of money here. So they won't possibly give up banking in the UK because there's money to be made here. And as Warren Buffett said, nobody on earth would turn down a profitable opportunity for the sake of having to pay a bit of tax. And he's right. So HSBC might move their head office out, but in practice they would still provide a banking service here because there would be money to make. How can we solve the problem of them moving their head office out and them saying we won't pay tax here? We come up with this is what I do, by the way. I started off by saying I'm a thinker. We come up with a different tax system for large multinational companies. That accounting system called country-by-country reporting was designed deliberately to provide the information for a different tax system. Right now, the way in which large companies are taxed is, well, it's a fairy tale. The largest company I know of is GE, General Electric, as once was, in America. It has 8,000 companies that make it up. BP, I think, is the largest based in this country. It's got 1,800 companies make it up. And we tax every single one of those companies independently as if they aren't owned by the same organisation. And then we try to adjust the books to try and prevent them shifting profits from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions, in and out of tax havens and so on. You could not make up a better way for accountants to make a fortune out of tax avoidance than the way we tax multinational companies now. It just couldn't be done better. No wonder partners in KPMG make nearly $1 million a year each. But if instead we say there's one bank, it's called HSBC, or it's one oil company called BP, or one pharmaceutical company called GlaxoSmithKline, or whatever else, and they make one profit the world over, and we simply allocate that profit to countries on the basis of where they make their sales, where they employ their people, and where they employ their real assets. Real assets are tangible things like this, not make-believe ones like trademarks, because those are just made up by lawyers as a way to shift profits around the world. That's just another part of the pinstripe mafia operation. I mean, all the licenses for all the drugs in the world are owned in tax havens, and a drug has never been developed in a tax haven. It's very odd, that, isn't it? But that's where the profits end up. So if instead we taxed on the basis of where the real economic activity was, then they can leave. It doesn't make any difference. We could still tax them here on the part of their global profits that are arising in this country. If we adopted that system, it doesn't matter whether they go or not. We will get our fair share, which is all that we can ask for. We can't ask for more than our fair share, but we would get it. The truth is, we can put in policies to stop this whole abuse in our. I would love it if it was. I still don't think we have got there yet. I don't pretend I've cracked it yet. I've had a go. There are others who are working on this theme. In this country, there's a chap called Steve Keen at Kingston University who's brilliant, but his books are pretty technical. But if you really are into economics, you must, if you are interested in it, you have to read Debunking Economics by Steve Keen, which is a brilliant book, but it's pretty mathematical. For those who taught maths, then that's a great book. My wife accuses me of talking maths sometimes, and it's true, I do on occasions. There's a very good book coming out early next year, which I've got a review copy of at the moment, by, she's retired as a professor now, Mary Mellor, which is called Debt and Something, but that is a stunning book. She's really, really captured some of the ideas very well. It's a book I wish I'd written. I'm quite jealous of it. I actually sent her an email last night telling her. There aren't many books that are like that. People like Joe Stiglitz, actually I'm afraid, write long books which don't have many answers in them. Thomas Piketty, if you want to go to sleep at night, that will keep you going for the next 6 months of going to sleep. You could read my book on tax havens, that I guarantee you'll be asleep in 5 minutes. Sold a lot of copies, but it's really turgid. This one is not. This is a popular accent. The tax haven book is deeply academic, and it really is turgid. But no, the idea is that, by the way, there's a really nice actual example today. There's a court case out today where George Osborne has been ruled to have acted illegally and putting the benefits cap on 1,400 people who are carers, adult carers, so caring for a relative. And a High Court judge has ruled that that's illegal. And he's pointed out how absurd the benefits cap on adult carers is, because forcing those people to try and get a job instead of caring for their relatives is costing a fortune in terms of social services provision, and also forcing those people to live elsewhere, because then would otherwise be subject to bedroom taxes and all sorts of things, or else would be forced to live in Birmingham and try to care for a relative in Croydon, which apparently was one of the cases that the judge was looking at. He said the sheer cost of imposing austerity on these people has been phenomenal, and he ruled it illegal. The ruling apparently is absolutely tour de force in how to destroy George Osborne. from a High Court judge. Why do we have to rely on a High Court judge to do it, for heaven's sake? But he's done it.
My question concerns the common belief, the ingrained belief, when you start talking about government printing money, is Germany, pre-war Germany. There are people walking around with marks in wheelbarrows. How do you overcome that against the popular press? How do you convince people that what you're saying is a good idea?
There are normally three things that come up. One is whenever I appear, it was mentioned that I had an interesting exchange with Andrew Neil a while ago. Poor old Andrew, he came in with his whole line of questions and I didn't answer any of them, which really upset him. I refused to work to his agenda, and one of the things he wanted to ask me about was Venezuela, and I said, oh, for heaven's sake, Andrew, grow up, let's ask some sensible questions or don't bother. I don't like taking prisoners, Andrew Neil in particular. But yeah, the questions of the Weimar Republic and Zimbabwe always come up. It was always Zimbabwe. I mean, even, I hate to say it, but, in the Labour leadership campaign, Zimbabwe came up. We're going to end up like Zimbabwe. No, we're not. We haven't got Robert Mugabe. We have a democracy. We have the right to throw whoever is printing money out of office every 5 years. And actually, we can signal our dissent during the course of by-elections, and we can campaign, and we can do all sorts of things in the meantime. I have some faith. We have an imperfect democracy, I know, and I'm well aware that the Conservatives are rigging it at the moment by changing boundaries and reducing the number of MPs and everything else. And I argue frequently that they are trying to destroy democracy, and I think they are blatantly trying to destroy democracy to capture it for the benefit of the City of London and elsewhere. But we still do have enough of a democracy that we can actually always throw out a government that prints too much money if it was bad for us. And people would. So I don't think there's any chance we could go to Zimbabwe. We do not have that scale of corruption. The Weimar Republic, well, let's be clear. Why was the Weimar Republic a failure? Because we imposed upon it the most phenomenal requirement that it repay debt, which it didn't owe us, and which it couldn't pay, and which was entirely our fault, and which one of the world's greatest economists, John Maynard Keynes, walked out of the Versailles Peace Conference saying, this cannot work. And he wrote a book in 1919 called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he basically forecast there would be another war because they couldn't possibly ask Germany to repay this. It would collapse its economy, and it did. Because if we don't have the national debt, there is nobody promising to underpin our currency, and there is no money left. But in Germany, they tried to make them repay it. They couldn't repay it, so they printed more to try and repay it, and it just got worse and worse. But we've learned that. We will never do it again. We're not going to ask for that to happen, and we, as from generation to generation, do not have to repay the national debt. We never have repaid the national debt. From 1694 onwards, the direction of the national debt has been upwards. And do you know what? Every time it's gone up, the economy's been richer, because that's literally true. What underpins most private sector pensions in this country? Any private sector pensioners here? Enjoying a pension paid from a private sector fund? Do you know what your pension comes from? It's the interest paid on national debt. The underpinning of all private pensions is government securities. And because more and more of us are getting grey-haired, I've noticed this evening in the audience that, honourable exceptions, most of us are heading towards grey hair, me included. I can see a few other exceptions, but we need government debt to underpin the payment of pensions, because government debt, if it's not a state pension where we rely upon the promise of the government, we rely instead upon the promise that the government will always honour its debt to underpin our pension instead. If we destroy the national debt now by repaying it, there won't be any security left for private pensioners either. It's another of the madnesses that underpins George Osborne's economics, along with rising house prices, which is another of his major fallacies and which underpins his promise to lend more money to first-time buyers at the moment. That has nothing to do with trying to create an opportunity for people to buy new houses. That has everything to do with keeping up existing house prices, because he wants people to borrow more and more money, because unless they borrow more and more money, he cannot repay his debt. I'd love to have the time to explain why that's true, but we're probably running out of time for that. Take into public ownership now, when the system is working, the underpinnings of the banks. That is all the architecture that lets payments be made and ensures that there is a system of cash point machines and so on. So I do think that should be owned by the state and licensed to banks. Do I think we need to actually own all the banks? No. I think it is possible to have acceptable banks. I didn't have any problem with the Co-op Bank until they did some silly things as a Co-op as a whole. But by and large, I didn't have a problem with them. I don't have a problem with Triodos Bank. I don't have a problem with the Nationwide Building Society. I do think it is possible for people to run responsible banks. What I think, however, is that we need to split investment banking completely from high street banking. Completely. No overlaps, no ring fencing, no nothing which have been offered to them, and which is going to take, we had the crash in 2008, and we're meant to partially split them in 2018. Took a decade, supposedly, and they're already trying to all backpedal against this. No, we have to split the risks, and we have to make sure that the infrastructure of banking is owned by the state, but that banks are allowed then to operate on the top of that infrastructure. They can take the risk, they should be using their share capital to take the risk. They should then be able to fail without imposing a cost on society, because if they went bust, we would simply say, okay, we'll take over all those accounts and pass it to another bank or to a state-owned bank to run it instead. So I think that is possible. You were desperate to ask a question, weren't you? Growth for unlimited reasons, and I don't believe the risks, which is one of the problems with actually, there's only 62 billion of those, and the rest is entirely effectively electronic money, all of which is created as debt, all of which has interest on it, and therefore you have an exponential function. Once you have interest paid on interest, you actually require continual growth to repay the debt. The advantage of having more money created by the government, which as I explained was possible in August because we faced a crisis with the currency, if we have more money created by the government, it is debt-free, and therefore you actually reduce the pressure on the requirement to pay interest to fuel growth. One of the reasons why I like the quantitative easing programme is it has pushed down interest rates to a very low level indeed, which has first of all meant that people can afford to live in houses because their mortgages have become more affordable, although of course house prices have gone up as a result, which is a problem because we don't build enough houses. But the low interest rates do make it possible for people to live in houses, and the low interest rate does reduce the pressure for growth's sake. I actually do think we are going to see a fundamental change in the economy over the next few years. I explore that issue in the book that's not here, The Courageous State, where I do actually offer a whole pile of theory on this, where I just think we are growing beyond our limits because of debt-paid money. And instead, I think that we are going to run out of technological change, and we're going to see a rebalancing. I do genuinely think that's why they need more of these. We are running out of technological changes. There are no big ones investing it because they can't think of any new products we want. There are no major new technological developments which are going to really transform the world, unlike the two biggest ones of last century, which, by the way, were not the car. Well, actually, the three biggest ones of last century really were not the car, they were not the internet, they were the Hoover, the washing machine, and the pill. Because they liberated women. And that was what really changed society. We've got nothing like that coming up, and therefore we're going to change our priorities, and instead we're going to spend on healthcare, we're going to spend on care, we're going to spend on green, we're going to spend on people, and I believe that's the way we need to go as well. But all of that is only possible if we are willing to actually tax and spend more, because that's the way to deliver the service, which actually we all want, because we're refusing to buy these, which is migrating slow.